This afternoon, we are going to hear from Dr. Brian Donovan. His research is phenomenal, and the work that he's doing to move this kind of conversation forward. As a research scientist, he works at BSCS, Science Learning. He holds a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Colorado State College, a master's in teaching from the University of San Francisco, and a Master's of Science in Biology and PhD in Science Education from Stanford University. His research explores how genetics education interacts with social cognitive biases to influence how students make sense of complex biological and social phenomena. By translating this research into frameworks that inform science instruction, curriculum development, and teacher education, Brian hopes to create a generation of researchers, teachers, and curriculum writers who know how to teach human difference in a more socially responsible manner. Brian's scholarship in this area has been published in a variety of peer-reviewed journals, including Science Education, the Journal of Research and Science Teaching, PLOS Biology, and Studies in History and Philosophy of Biological and Biomedical Sciences. Currently, he is the principal investigator of an NSF-funded project, just about $1.3 million, that uses experimental, quasi-experimental, and qualitative research methods to identify the cognitive, social, and educational factors that link the learning of human genetics to reduction in racial bias. Before earning his PhD, Brian taught in the Stanford Teacher Education Program. His career began in education as an elementary and middle school science teacher, working for 7 years in San Francisco schools. Would you help me welcome Brian Donovan too?
If you'll bear with me for a moment, I guess my presentation did not make it.
Brian, you should just go ahead.
Oh, there it is. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that warm introduction, Keith, and thank you to the Royal Society and to the Adelphi Genetics Forum for inviting me out. Today I'm going to argue that genetics education needs to move beyond teaching about Mendel and his peas if it wants to accomplish what I think is a very important educational goal, which is combating the spread of white supremacist propaganda online. And I recognize that's an exceedingly provocative argument to make, not just because it's the 200th anniversary of Mendel's birthday, but also because, the words genetics and race typically don't go well together. And so I'm going to take some time to unpack, what I think are the flaws in genetics education and what I think we need to do about those flaws. And I'm going to use several of my published and even some of my unpublished studies to make that argument to you. But before I begin, I want to start with a story about my friend Kay. So Kay is a high school teacher in the Midwestern United States. And like many biology teachers, she has vivid memories of learning biology herself. So she remembers sitting in her advanced placement biology classes and multiplying fractions and drawing squares, but not totally understanding what the purpose of that was. But more importantly than that, she remembers thinking to herself while learning that her genes were her destiny, that there was no escaping her family's history. And this idea that genes are destiny, several scholars, both in Europe and in the United States and even in Africa and in Brazil, have found that this is a tacit idea that is present in the genetics curriculum. And sometimes it's even explicitly communicated to students. And as we all know, throughout history, this idea has been used throughout the eugenics research program of the early 20th century to justify all kinds of atrocities. It was used in the United States to justify anti-miscegenation laws. It was used as a motivation for genocide here in Europe. And if we fast forward in time to when today Kay is teaching biology, she herself starts to teach the way she was taught by her teachers. You tend to revert back to the way that you were taught when you began teaching because it's so overwhelming. And so she begins communicating this idea that DNA is destiny to students. And that was despite the fact that she had earned a PhD in molecular biology from Stanford University. So, her years of training had told her that the science of inheritance was far more complicated than a Punnett square, and yet when she was in front of a room with her students, she reverted back to this idea that everything boils down to a Punnett square. And this discrepancy between what she knew to be true, which is that the science of genetics is complicated, and what she taught as truth, which is that Mendel kind of had it all right, it was gnawing away at her when I first met her. And she was worried that by teaching her students Mendelian genetics, she was somehow unintentionally entrenching racist ideas in her students. And given the history of genetic science, that's not a far-fetched worry to have. And so when I met her, she was having these concerns. We were talking about these issues actually at a conference where we were redesigning our high school biology curriculum at the organization that I work for. And she sounded like she was, potentially interested in doing something scary. So I said, would you be willing to teach genetics to your students to try to challenge some of these prejudice ideas about race that exist in society and online? And, she was up for the challenge, but she had some concerns. And those concerns were real. She said, what if by doing this in my classroom, I inadvertently commit a public act of racism and I hurt the black and the brown students in my classroom? That's a real fear that teachers have doing this kind of work. And I said, I understand where you're coming from, but what if it didn't harm your students? What if it actually helped to tackle these controversial issues head on? And what if we desperately need to do that work in this historical moment? And so you can imagine how she responded. And the argument that I made to Kay several years ago is the same argument that I want to make to you today, which is that if we don't change the way we teach genetics, then we could be accelerating the spread of some cognitive forms of racial prejudice. But if we do change the way we teach genetics, we have this excellent opportunity to pre-bunk and inoculate our youth against these prejudice ideas before they encounter them online. And that means we need to move genetics education beyond Mendel if we want to do this, because I don't really see any other way to get at it. So that's the argument I'm going to make. And I think it's important today to discuss these issues because in America, there are about 15 million high schoolers, okay? And about 75% of them go online several or more times a day. And I know this to be true because I have a 12-year-old son, and he's always online, and he's on YouTube, actually, quite often. The problem is that studies are now finding, that exposure to racist misinformation is significantly correlated with YouTube usage. And what we now know from a variety of different research projects, but particularly by Aaron Panofsky at UCLA, is that the white supremacist community in the United States is exceedingly efficient and systematic in disseminating ideas about the genetic inferiority of certain races online. They have whole programs and arguments that they just ship ideas out, and they get it online, and they try to get adolescents. Often in those arguments are ideas from racist manifestos. So manifestos written by people like Anders Breivik, who murdered 77 people in Norway in 2011 in a racially motivated hate crime. And so this is a little bit of a trigger warning, and we're going to read a little bit of what Anders writes in his manifesto. So he says, blue eyes and blonde hair and possibly many psychological traits almost never survives a race mixing process due to the fact that Nordic genotypes are recessive, unlike African, Arab, or Oriental genotypes, which are considerably more genetically dominant. This kind of argument is really teed up to resonate with how adolescents think about genetics, because the genetics curriculum is Mendelian. And if you read between the lines here, you will see many Mendelian phenomena in textbooks, like blue eyes, brown eyes. It's not actually, it's more complicated than that, but that's how textbooks discuss it. And then a lot of Mendelian terminology here, right? So it's this kind of information that kids could be exposed to when they go online and they start to encounter misinformation about genetics and race. And so if we combine these statistics, basically 75% of kids are online all the time, 17% of high schools are exposed possibly to racist misinformation like that, then what that suggests is about 13% of US high school students, or about 2 million high schoolers, could be exposed to that kind of misinformation during the course of their high school career. And to put that in context, that's roughly 30 students per middle or high school in the United States. Yet, 98% of high school students take biology during their 4 years of high school at some point. And biology education is really the first and the last place that we systematically and formally teach the sciences of inheritance. So really, it could be this excellent opportunity where we could inoculate our youth against some of these ideas. Now, I'm not claiming that we should stop teaching Mendel, and I'm not claiming that, that genetics education is the cause of racism in society in its many different forms, or the sole solution to it. But I think it's a really important opportunity that we could use to make a positive contribution toward these issues. So you might be wondering now, like, well, what are you actually saying? Are you saying we just teach about this kind of ABCs of genetics and kids are going to figure this all out? Like they're going to be able to detect racist misinformation and ignore it? And that's not what I'm arguing. Life is not that simple. And I see kind of 3 barriers that we need to overcome if we want to work toward this goal. The first thing is that the science of genetics that kids need to understand is quite complicated. It's not the simple stuff, it's the complicated stuff. And right now, genetics education isn't set up to teach about genetic complexity. And even if we did a good job of solving those 2 problems, we still have this third problem, which are who are the teachers who are going to be courageous enough to do this kind of teaching in their classroom? That's the last problem. So let's talk about the complications. So there's essentially 5 ideas that I think kids, if they knew and were taught in school, it could help them to sniff out misinformation about race and genetics. So the first one is pretty foundational. 0.1% of the human genome is variable DNA that differs between individuals. Now that doesn't seem like a lot of DNA, but there are 3 billion nucleotides in the human genome. So we're talking about 3 million nucleotides of difference. When you add that up, that's actually a lot. But one of the most replicated findings in human population genetics is that when we look at that variable DNA, most of that variability is found among people of the same population. So often, like when people are talking about race, they're talking about geographic ancestry. Those 2 things get conflated quite often. So if we look at geographic populations, what we find is that people from different continents are about 5% more different than, genomically speaking, than people from the same continent. So there are differences between human populations, but they're not well differentiated differences. They're not huge, okay? Now, some people might think, well, what about that 5% of DNA? That 5% of DNA, maybe that's the stuff that causes racial disparities in society. But what we've learned over the last 20 years from genome-wide association studies is that complex traits typically have a fairly weak association with polygenic variation, right? And so I think if kids understand these 3 ideas, they're going to be set up to see some of the flaws in white supremacist arguments. But there's some older ideas here that I think need to be taught as well, which is, you know, because people inherit their genes with their environment, we really should be skeptical of the claim that racial disparities in society always boil down to genes. And that's because no one in science has ever done a fair scientific test, a really high quality causal inference study to get at this question, is racial inequality genetically determined? So I think these ideas help because a lot of white supremacists, they talk about racial purity, which implies that there's some kind of homogeneity among people of the same race, right? But most variation is found within a population, so that idea is flawed. A lot of white supremacists claim that there's like drastic amounts of differences, genetically speaking, between human races, right? But the reality shows that human racial groups are not super genetically differentiated. There are differences. Those differences are not as big as many people might think. So that idea of drastic difference between groups is flawed. Finally, some folks think, like, oh, somewhere at some point, some scientist is going to identify some critical gene that is responsible for disparity in this trait. But the reality is that most of the traits that are involved in disparities in society are complex traits, and they have multifactorial explanations. You can't boil it down to variation in a single gene. So that idea is flawed. And so what I think the white supremacist community is failing to acknowledge is an idea that any student could easily understand with a high-quality science education, which is that correlation is not necessarily causation. And so what that means is if you have two racial groups and they differ in their trait values, their allele frequencies, and their environmental exposures, which is almost always the case, then it's really hard to say if disparities in that trait are due to genes or environments. And no one's done the fair test to figure that out. Like it's unethical to use CRISPR in gene editing technologies to knock out or change genes in an embryo and wait until a kid achieves adulthood to see if genes are driving a disparity. No one's probably ever going to do that, at least not in a democratic society, right? And then on top of that, no one's taken children from their homes and randomized them to different environments to systematically control for environmental exposure. So no one's really done the fair scientific test to get at it, which is why it's reasonable to be skeptical of this claim. But what we can do as a society, one thing we do have control over is social policy. It's not perfect control, but if we wanted to do a fair scientific test of this idea that racial inequality is genetically determined, then one way to do that would be to treat everyone the same. Give everyone equal access to houses, to healthcare, economic opportunity. Do that for, say, 400 years. You're basically making the environment the same. And if in 400 years there are still racial disparities, then you are in a much stronger position to argue that those disparities are genetic. But you're never going to hear a white supremacist tell you that that racism should be eliminated, right? Instead, they're going to tell you it's natural, so there's no point in doing anything about it. And ironically, or perhaps out of naivete, they're going to claim that science shows that this is indeed a fact, right? So am I saying we should teach about the simplicity in Mendelian genetics? No, what I'm arguing for is that kids need to learn about the causal and the quantitative complexities of human genetics research, and they need to learn about that stuff for the explicit purpose of challenging the assumptions in white supremacist arguments. So it's not simple, it's complicated. What I just spent like the last 5 minutes talking about takes 3 to 4 weeks for students to learn in a high school biology classroom. But make no mistake about it, right now, online, the white supremacist community takes advantage of our ignorance about these ideas and these arguments because they're not taught in biology classes. So then you're like, well, what is genetics education actually doing in the United States about this problem? And if you look to the past, to the pre-war curriculum, it directly contributed to this problem during the eugenics era. So this is from a biology textbook called Biology and Human Affairs from 1941. It was a widely read textbook in the United States. It says, human race is a matter of biological kinship, not a place of residence. The Caucasian, Australoid, Negroid, or woolly-haired, and yellow, brown, or Mongoloid are scientifically agreed upon racial classification systems. A biologist expects to find natural differences in people. He is prepared to find great differences in mechanical, artistic, and intellectual ability. He knows there are innate differences in persons that cannot be removed, and that it's hard for people like us to become reconciled with these differences and to the social and economic difficulties rising out of them. Therefore, an understanding of biology prepares for living more comprehendingly in the world of natural inequalities that we have and will have until all persons are born alike. Biology education in the middle 20th century. Today, behind those arguments is an underlying theory or model of human difference. And it's called genetic essentialism. And it's a social cognitive form of prejudice. It's widely studied by social psychologists and sociologists. It's also a biological misconception So it's the idea that racial groups are basically categorically different in their genes. Each race has its own special set of genes that everyone in that group has, that no one in another group has, and therefore genetics is the explanation for disparities in society. That is a really strong genetic essentialist view. That's what I would argue that textbook passage, that's where it's coming from, right? Now, if you look in textbooks today, you won't see genetic essentialist messages, but race does come up indirectly. So it most often comes up when talking about the monogenic disorders in the Mendelian curriculum. Diseases like sickle cell anemia. So textbooks will say the allele responsible for sickle cell, common among people of African descent, and cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is the most common fatal genetic disorder among Caucasians. Now, it is true that those diseases occur at a higher prevalence in those groups. I don't think it's a problem to teach about that. The question I had when I was in graduate school is, well, are those ideas, when learned, are they unintentionally reinforcing genetic essentialist views among students? And they could be, because if each race gets its own special disease, that implies some kind of uniformity among the group. Since different groups get different diseases, that implies a categorical difference between the groups, especially because textbooks are not discussing the underdiagnosis of sickle cell anemia in white populations, for example. And then it's not a far-fetched leap for a kid to wonder, well, if disease disparities boil down to genes, then is it also possible that other disparities in society in complex traits, let's say, also boil down to genes? So it could be that these passages are tacitly reinforcing this view of human difference. And so when I was in graduate school, I published 3 different double-blinded and randomized controlled trials to explore this question. And the logic of the studies was like a gene knockout study. I knocked racial terminology out of the curriculum in order to understand the effect that it has when it's actually in the curriculum, which is the business's usual way of teaching about these diseases. And so if you're in my classroom, half of you are randomly assigned to read about the prevalence of certain genetic diseases in certain races. The other half of you are learning about those genetic diseases without talking about their prevalence in certain groups. And I didn't have a lot of money then because I was in graduate school, so they're all underpowered studies. But what I found in all 3 studies was the same result, which is that if you compared the 2 conditions, the kids in the racial condition were significantly more likely to endorse the idea that races differ in intelligence and academic ability because of genes. And if you were to ask them to explain, say, racial test score disparities, only kids in the racial condition would say things like this: Black and Hispanic students may have genes that cause them to have a harder time learning. So that's problematic for several reasons, not just prejudice. It's problematic because those traits they weren't even in the curriculum. So kids are generalizing to a new domain. Kids are sense makers. They come into the classroom, they live in America. Race is an organizing concept of America. They have questions about it. And they walk into the biology classroom and a teacher's like, hey, Punnett squares, they do so much work for us. And then they learn about monogenic diseases as the prime human example, right? So that's why I think we need to go beyond Mendel, because Mendel could be a part of the problem if it's increasing public belief in genetic essentialism. And instead, what I think we need to offer kids is what I call a humane genetics education. So I think we should teach kids about the complexity of inheritance for the explicit purpose of refuting these genetic essentialist ideas. They are scientific misconceptions. Make no mistake about it. Ernst Mayr and Dobzhansky both agreed that essentialism was an impediment to the development of the modern evolutionary synthesis. So this is within our wheelhouse as biologists to challenge these ideas. And so what that means is we need to help kids understand and develop accurate models of human variability and explanations for that variability. And then kids need to have the opportunity to apply those models to criticize genetic essentialist ideas, models, beliefs, and explanations. It needs to be explicit, in my opinion. And we've done several studies on a humane genetics education. And the most recent one we started 3 years ago before the pandemic started. Then the pandemic shut down educational research in schools. And then American schools blew up about critical race theory. So it's been very hard to get this study done. It's taken a long time. But we do have a relatively decently powered randomized trial here with about 1,000 students from geographically distinct regions in the United States, mostly in high school, nested within 51 classrooms and 15 teachers. This is a within teacher cluster randomized trial. So we randomly assign kids to learn from different curricula in different classrooms within a teacher. So what it looks like is 28 days of genetics instruction. We survey the kids about their beliefs about race and their knowledge. Then half of each teacher's classroom, so if you have 4 classrooms as a teacher, 2 of them are going to get Mendel. They're going to learn from Mendel for 14 days. 2 are going to get humane genetics. We survey again. Then there's the crossover. So the kids who get Mendel first, then get humane. The kids who get humane, then get Mendel. We survey a 3rd time. So it's a crossover trial. And then we measured on our surveys kids' knowledge of complicated forms of inheritance, their belief in genetic essentialism, and the extent to which they explained racially stereotyped traits like athleticism and science ability using genes versus the environment. And if you want to get into the weeds about psychometrics, I'm happy to talk about the measurement strategy here, but I'm going to skip over a lot of that and a lot of the statistics. So what do we find? So at baseline, the 2 groups don't differ in their knowledge of genetic complexity, and they're below average in their knowledge of genetic complexity. Then the kids who get humane genetics, they increase significantly more in their knowledge of complexity relative to the kids who get Mendel. The 2 groups are then significantly different. Then the second group of kids gets humane genetics, and they increase significantly more in their knowledge of the complexity of inheritance relative to the kids who are now getting Mendel. And then the 2 groups don't differ at the end in their knowledge, and they're above average, and they're significantly above where they started. So we get an increase in the knowledge of genetic complexity. If we look at belief in genetic essentialism, it is the mirror opposite pattern, right? The 2 groups do not differ in their belief in genetic essentialism at the outset. The kids who get humane genetics significantly decline in that belief relative to the kids who get Mendel. There is now a significant difference between the 2 groups after the first half have been treated. Then the second half of kids get humane genetics, and they decline significantly more in their belief in genetic essentialism relative to the kids who are now getting Mendel. The 2 groups are no longer different, and they're significantly below their starting point. However, when we look at explanations for racially stereotyped traits like science ability and athleticism, there's a really interesting finding. So first thing is mirror opposite results, right? So if we look at genetic explanations, humane genetics is causing a reduction in genetic explanations for racially stereotyped traits. If we look at environmental explanations, we see an increase in kids' tendency to use the environment to explain those same traits. But I want to direct your attention to these lines right here. So these are the kids who got humane genetics first, and now they're getting Mendel. And there's a significant increase in their genetic explanations. And then a significant decrease in their environmental explanations for those traits. So even after we've de-biased, quote unquote, kids with humane genetics, Mendel still has an impact in how kids are thinking. So these are not flukes. They're consistent with other randomized trials and quasi-experiments that we've published in my lab. And what I think this means is that humane genetics is a relatively safe and reliable tool for preventing the development of genetic essentialism, but it's most safely implemented after kids have already learned some Mendelian genetics. And that's why I think we need to move beyond Mendel. So if you take that hypothesis to be accurate, and you believe in the evidence I just presented you, then the next question you naturally want to have answered is like, who's going to be courageous enough to do this kind of teaching and learning? So that raises a question of how did it go for Kate? She was nervous about committing a public act of racism, and she took a big risk, and she was very courageous because where she teaches in the Midwest, she's told me she has several students who have family members who are in the KKK. That's a risk that doesn't come along with the normal teaching of genetics. Nevertheless, when she finished, she said it was a huge rush. That is the kind of thing you say when you've prepared for an overwhelming challenge that really scares you, but you've done enough work to deal with that challenge and you have that sense of relief after you've taught, right? So what did she do to prepare? Well, she came to one of my professional developments. It's a 40-hour course. That's how much training it takes to do this teaching well. She learned with the student materials because no one's ever taught this stuff in most biology classrooms, so we got to teach biology teachers the new knowledge. She learned about how to set up a safe classroom learning environment to do this kind of work with students, how to respond to kids who seem threatened, shut down, defensive, all right? She learned how the intervention was designed to work, and she also learned about a lot of research on prejudice. And because of that learning, she felt confident about implementing this kind of instruction in her classroom, despite the risks that she was taking. And that confidence, I think, led to real impact. So this is actually an email that Kay received from a parent after she was done teaching. It said, "I thought you might like to know, my son said that your class changed the way he perceives the world, and he's not entirely comfortable with that." Which is a great thing as a teacher. I mean, that's music to your ears, correct? But as a social scientist, I want to quantify the impact. That's naturally where I want to go. So my big question is, how many students need to receive a humane genetics education in order to get one kid to move from believing to not believing in that idea? And that's called the number needed to treat. And without getting into how you calculate that, we have calculated it. And so for every 12 students who receive humane genetics, we predict that one kid exhibits a wholesale change in their beliefs about race. So in a classroom of 30 students, we would predict 2 kids move from believing to not believing in genetic essentialism after they receive humane genetics. And so by extension, if all 15 million high schoolers in the United States were to learn from humane genetics next year, then that would suggest we would predict about 1.2 million of them would move from believing to not believing in genetic essentialism, which, to put in context, is 65% of the total estimated population of high school students who could be exposed to racist misinformation about genetics and race online. So if we want to achieve that kind of broad impact, we need more research about how to do this well. We need new standards and new curriculum, because the standards and curriculum that exist in the world right now are not about this stuff, that's for sure. New teacher education programs, and then public support for the work. And that's a hard thing to come by right now. And I think if we don't do anything, then what we are allowing is for this viral spread of misinformation about genetics and race online. We're doing nothing about it. And genetics education is really the first and the last place that people learn genetics. It's our one opportunity to systematically change how kids think about these ideas. And that's why I think we should move genetics education beyond Mendel. So if you want to contact me, you can reach me here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Green, fine. Thank you very much for that. Many questions, but just trying to be succinct. So recent developments in genetics as science obviously now mean that science itself, shall we say, offers some genuinely emancipatory resources. What does that mean for the fact that human beings are, in principle, anthropologically equal before this science has come onto our radar?
So let me try to revoice your question to understand where you're coming from. So if we take it as an assumption that humans are equal across racial groups, that's a fundamental assumption that we make, right?
Yes.
And then the science of genetics shows that there are differences, or can you clarify that part of your question?
Well, this is the point that you are making, that this re-envisioned approach to genetics education becomes a means by which students can learn to resist not just genetic essentialism,
Got it.
but multiple forms of thinking in racist and racialist ways. But this is new science, relatively speaking. How does this, well, how can we contextualize the recentness of this science with the fact that from the Enlightenment and before the Enlightenment, the assumption of anthropological non-parity has been de facto? So I guess the claim here is that science can't really be positioned as being fundamentally emancipatory in the types of ways that some people doing this kind of important work are claiming.
Yeah. So how do you rectify the history of eugenics with the argument that you're making to kids? Fundamentally, is like one issue, right? And so we teach kids about the history of eugenics, and it requires, because you have this interesting problem, which is that using genetic concepts and genetic science to support racist ideas, like that hasn't gone away. It's still part of scientific culture. That still happens, right? And so it's like we can't just throw eugenics under the bus and say that happened then. It's not happening anymore. We do things better now. It's much more complicated, and we don't have these problems anymore. So we don't do that, right? But science is a human endeavor, and politics and social ideas can't be separated from science, right? So we take a stance on science education, which is that you can't separate it out necessarily from the political and historical context of the society in which scientists live. So we also don't take a presentist perspective on things either. So we say, look, in the past, these things happened. Here were the problems with those things. Today, we can see similar things going on in certain places. But by and large, if you look at the field as a whole of genetics, today you see geneticists, say, signing, letters to the New York Times refuting a book like, say, Nicholas Wade's recent book because they think it promoted racialist ideas. And that wasn't exceedingly common in the early 20th century. So society and culture has changed. And we do have better ideas about how inheritance works. And a lot of those ideas are pointing us away from these earlier ideas, but we still have this problem we have to contend with. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Great question, and a difficult one to answer.
Yes. You have the mic.
Yeah, thank you for that talk, which I think we'd all agree it is an important area. But I wonder whether one of the reasons why Mendel and Punnett squares have such a hold in schools is that it's so easy to examine, because I've been involved in trying to think of ways of getting beyond that. And it tends to fall down in that it's very hard to think of the right questions to put in exams. So my question is, have you done much work on examining the more humane genetics courses? And do you have suggestions and resources on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In educational research, sometimes people say tests are the tail that wags the dog, so to speak. And that is a real problem. I mean, the test questions that exist are predominantly about Mendelian forms of inheritance. I think we're starting to see that change in the United States among researchers they're called discipline-based educational researchers. So these are folks who have a PhD in biology but are doing educational research, and they're starting to construct new assessments of student knowledge that get at more complex forms of inheritance. And right now, that's in a research phase, and so those tests or assessment questions are published in journals, and who knows if they're getting beyond that. But there's a great resource called Course Source, and it's developed by biologists who do this kind of research. And there's a bunch of assessments in there that kind of go beyond Mendel. But I will say we just finished, actually, I don't want to give away Greg's talk, but Greg Raddick and I collaborate on an NSF grant. And one of the postdocs on our team, she just finished this content analysis of test questions that are used in biology courses at the undergraduate level. And basically the main finding is that it's exactly what you would suspect. There's just not many questions that are dealing with complicated forms of inheritance. So we have development work to do there. And I think I'll leave it at that because Greg will probably address how you could talk about Mendel in an updated kind of more sophisticated way. And I don't want to give away any of his ideas since they've been so influential for me. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Are there any mics on this side of the room?
Thank you for the talk. Could you put up a comparative slide between the Humane and the Mendel characteristics?
Oh.
Do you have something like that? Yeah.
Oh, like in terms of content?
Yeah.
Yeah, can I just say it for you right now?
It would be better with a slide, and that would generate more questions, I'm sure.
Well, I wish you had talked with me before I put together my presentation. Mendelian forms of education tend to be about explaining variability between individuals. So the questions that you're trying to answer are how do you get different forms of a gene into the same person? And it tends to be about independent assortment and like homologous recombination and how that generates genetic diversity within a person and how traits change over time within a family. Whereas humane genetics is about a different phenomenon. It's about explaining variation at the population level and explaining variation across populations. So the focus isn't really on individuals, it's on populations. And the traits that we're dealing with are typically not traits that are types, like this phenotype versus that phenotype. They're continuous traits that differ in a more or less kind of way. That's the vast majority of ways that humans differ. And so then they require a more sophisticated explanation because you can't have a single gene where you get this genotype and that genotype and have two different types. That's not a good explanation for something that changes continuously. So that's how the contents differ. But then there's also a difference in the purpose. So the purpose of a humane genetics education is literally to challenge deterministic and essentialist ideas. And that is not a purpose in standard kind of ways of teaching genetics. So I've done my best. Hopefully that crystallizes it for you.
Thanks, Mike. Is there a mic on this side of the room at all? Thank you, but could we get a mic on this side for the next set of questions? Because no questions have come from this side. So thank you. Next question.
Okay, I have a question over here. I'm sorry. How do we get society to understand that what they have been taught about genetics, how do we get them to understand that they were taught a flawed science?
I mean, it's really tricky to do this kind of teaching in classrooms because it makes like, everyone has a racial identity, at least in America, right? And it makes people's racial identities very salient to their learning. And as we know, like then white people can get pretty defensive, like when learning about these ideas. And so to help people understand that your ideas about the world, genetically speaking, may not be entirely accurate. You might not have been told the whole truth, let's say. That kind of annoys people. Because people want to have accurate ideas about the world around them, and they don't like to be told that they don't have accurate views. Like people typically don't take well to that. And then their race is tied up in it as well. So it's very threatening for folks. And the way that we do it is to acknowledge the threatening aspect of the teaching and the learning. And we try to build into our curriculum common sense ways that people think about race in the United States. There's different characters. We have these characters called Robin and Taylor. And like Robin has a very racialized, essentialist view of things. And Taylor has a very unconvincing counter argument to Robin's views. And the kids are evaluating evidence as they learn. And they're evaluating not their own ideas, but these other people's ideas. That makes it a little bit safer. And over time, these characters, they change their thinking by evaluating evidence. Robin's like, I got this wrong. Taylor's like, and I got this wrong. And that allows for kids to change their ideas by evaluating evidence. And I think that's kind of the way we need to approach it, is we need highly trained teachers who are thinking about kids as human beings, not just these like memorizers of facts. And we need to be cognizant of how difficult it is for kids to do this learning. Because if we're not, it just backfires and people go in the opposite direction. And that's not helpful.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you.
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So one of the things that I talk about that's not really relevant to this specific talk, but it makes sense, is that there was a time when we used to put oil in a skillet.
Can't hear you.
There was a time when we would put oil in a skillet in little kernels, and we would put it over the fire, and about 25 minutes later we'd have popcorn. And now I have a silver machine in my kitchen, and it has a button that says popcorn.
Yeah, you can't put the Jiffy Pop in that though.
And
Yeah.
so, exactly. And so everything has to happen in an instance. And one of the greatest elements to this entire discourse is time.
Right.
Your question.
Thanks. Steve Humphreys from UCL. I think the idea that you just put forward of having these two characters is really excellent. That's something we should all think about how we can use. I'd like to ask you about your number needed to treat, because
All right.
To put it simply, what you're trying to do is get the white kids to understand that they are not genetically superior, and the black and Hispanic kids to understand that they're not genetically inferior. And I just wondered if you approach those two aspects differently. In other words, is your number needed to treat different?
That's an excellent question. No, so it's not differentiated. So essentially what we're doing is we have these scales, right? These are like validated psychological scales that measure belief in genetic essentialism. There's typically a cutoff point where someone goes from explicitly agreeing with a statement like racial differences in academic ability are caused by genes to disagreeing. So that's our cutoff, right? So then we're getting the odds ratio basically on statements like that. Then we're transforming that into the adjusted risk ratios. Then, the adjusted risk ratio divided by the sample size is your number needed to treat, I believe, if I'm getting it right and I'm remembering. So that's what it's based on. It's not calculated across subgroups of kids. For one, we're not really powered to do those estimates in our samples for, say, Black and Hispanic students, because in the United States, we're talking about 10 to 13% of students are Black. So the chance of having a big enough sample size in a study like this is kind of hard to do that. But we did do that in one study, we looked at the number needed to treat among kids who have less knowledge about the complexity of inheritance versus more knowledge about the complexity of inheritance. And it's a really nice variable because we Roche modeled it, so it's like got good psychometric properties. And what we find is that among kids who really only know about Mendel, they don't know about the multifactorial stuff, the number needed to treat is 40. And among kids who have high genomics literacy in that complicated kind of way, the number needed to treat is 12. So it really suggests that knowledge of complexity, as Greg will talk about, is really important for setting the stage for this kind of teaching and learning. It's really a risk factor for being less prejudiced, but I don't think it necessarily guarantees that that's going to happen. But if you don't have knowledge about the complexity of inheritance, you haven't had the opportunities, really the privilege, to learn about those ideas, because it typically takes a long time in your biology education to learn about complexity. It's something that you achieve late in the undergraduate career, right? Or even in graduate school. And having gone all the way through to get a master's in biology, I say that from experience, right? So I think it's something we're not doing well at the K-12 level.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but there's lots of amazing questions that we can have maybe later.
Yeah, I put my contact information up there too, so you can always email me.
But thank you, Brian,
Thank you very much.
for joining us.